I watched the bulldozer roll onto my property at 7 in the morning, and my first thought was that I was still asleep. There was no way the Sonoma Valley Estates Homeowners Association had actually sent heavy machinery onto my vineyard without warning, without permission, without even a conversation. But the diesel engine roar was too loud to be a dream, and the smell of torn earth too sharp to be anything but real. I sprinted out of my house in sweatpants and a t-shirt, my coffee mug still in hand, as the yellow monster began ripping through my Cabernet Sauvignon vines. These weren't just any vines. These were 20-year-old plants that I had nurtured since I bought this property in Napa Valley back in 2004. Each vine represented countless hours of pruning, training, protecting from pests and weather. Each one produced grapes that I sold to local wineries for premium prices. And this machine was tearing them out of the ground like they were weeds. "Stop! Stop right now!" I screamed, running toward the bulldozer and waving my arms. The operator either didn't hear me or didn't care. He kept pushing forward, the blade slicing through another row of vines. The old wood cracked and splintered, leaves and grape clusters scattered across the ground. I felt sick. A white SUV sat parked near my property line, and standing next to it was Patricia Henderson, the HOA president, clipboard in hand, watching the destruction like she was supervising a routine landscaping project. "Patricia, what the hell is going on?" I shouted as I reached her. She turned to me with that smile she always wore during HOA meetings, the one that made her look like she was doing you a favor, even as she fined you for having your trash cans visible from the street. "Good morning, Keith. I'm glad you're awake. We're implementing the community walking trail project that was approved at last month's meeting." "What meeting? I never got notice of any meeting." "The notice was posted on the community website and sent via email 3 weeks ago," she said, consulting her clipboard. "The vote was 15-3 in favor of the trail." "This is my property. You can't just come onto my land and tear up my vineyard." Patricia's smile tightened. "Actually, if you review your HOA agreement, Section 47B states that the association reserves the right to access any property for community improvement projects that benefit the overall neighborhood. The walking trail will connect the northern and southern sections of the community, and according to our survey, your property provides the most direct route." "Survey? What survey?" "The one conducted by our landscape architect last month. You would have received the results if you had attended the meeting." My hands were shaking. I wanted to grab that clipboard and throw it into the bulldozer. I was in Oregon last month visiting my daughter. I never saw any email. And even if there was a vote, you can't just destroy my vineyard. These vines are my livelihood. Do you have any idea how much money this represents? "The HOA is prepared to offer compensation for the affected area," Patricia said. She flipped through her papers. "We've calculated the square footage at approximately 0.3 acres. At current land values, we're offering $12,000. I actually laughed, though there was nothing funny about it. $12,000? Patricia, these vines produce about 6 tons of grapes per acre. That's roughly 4,000 pounds from this section alone. At $4 per pound, that's $16,000 per year. And these vines will keep producing for another 20 to 30 years. You're offering me $12,000 for what could be $500,000 in future harvests? That seems rather inflated, Keith. You're not accounting for costs and other factors." "I'm accounting for 20 years of income you're destroying right now." The bulldozer operator had stopped and climbed down from his machine. He walked over to us, glancing between me and Patricia. "Is there a problem? Because if there's a dispute, I'm not touching another thing until you folks work it out." "There's no dispute," Patricia said quickly. "Continue with the work." "Like hell you will." I stepped between the operator and his machine. "I'm telling you right now, if you destroy one more vine, I will sue you and this HOA for every penny you have." Patricia's pleasant expression finally cracked. "Keith, you're being unreasonable. This is a democratically approved project for the good of the entire community. Your property values will actually increase with improved amenities." "My property value means nothing if I can't grow grapes. That's the whole reason I bought here. This is agricultural land in a wine region. I have a business license, a commercial grape operation. You can't just override that with an HOA vote. The HOA covenant supersedes individual commercial interests when it comes to community welfare." Patricia recited like she had memorized it from somewhere. I pulled out my phone. I'm calling my lawyer right now. And if either of you touches another vine, I'm calling the sheriff's department to report property destruction and trespassing. The bulldozer operator held up his hands. Look, man, I don't want any trouble. Lady, you told me this was all cleared and legal. It is legal, Patricia insisted, but I could hear uncertainty creeping into her voice now. Then you won't mind waiting while I make these calls, I said. I walked away from them, my heart pounding so hard I could barely think straight. My lawyer, Martin Brenner, had handled the purchase of my property and knew the setup. I dialed his number, praying he was in the office. Martin Brenner Law. Martin, it's Keith Baxter. I need help immediately. The HOA is bulldozing my vineyard right now. They're what? I explained the situation in rapid-fire sentences. Martin listened, asked a few questions, then told me to take pictures and videos of everything and not to let them continue any work. He said he would file for an emergency restraining order within the hour. When I returned to Patricia and the operator, I started recording video on my phone. Patricia Henderson, I'm documenting that you have destroyed approximately 150 of my grapevines without permission, proper notice, or legal authority. I'm also documenting that you're currently trespassing on my property. My attorney is filing for an emergency restraining order, and if you continue this work, you'll be in contempt of court. Patricia's face had gone red. You can't threaten me. I'm not threatening. I'm informing you of the legal reality. These vines represent my income. You've just destroyed roughly $12,000 worth of this year's harvest alone, and you've eliminated decades of future production. I will be suing you personally and the HOA for damages. The HOA has insurance for this type of thing. Good. They're going to need it. The bulldozer operator started walking back to his machine. I'm out. Patricia, you need to sort this out with your insurance and lawyers. I'm not getting stuck in the middle of a lawsuit. Wait, we have a contract, Patricia called after him, and he'll honor it once you have proper authorization, I said, which you don't. Patricia stared at the destroyed section of my vineyard, at the torn earth and broken vines, and for a moment I saw something like doubt cross her face. But then her jaw set, and she looked at me with cold determination. This isn't over, Keith. The community voted for this trail, and it will be built. You're putting your personal profit over the well-being of your neighbors. My personal profit? Patricia, I've lived here for 20 years. I've been growing grapes since before most of these houses were built. The HOA formed 8 years ago, and ever since then, you and your friends have been trying to turn this into some kind of suburban cookie-cutter development. This is agricultural land, wine country. That's why we're here. Times change. The community wants amenities, not farms. Then the community should have moved somewhere else. She gathered her papers and walked to her SUV. Before getting in, she called back, You'll be hearing from our attorneys. I'm counting on it. After she drove away, I spent the next 2 hours walking through my vineyard, documenting every destroyed vine, taking measurements, photographing the damage from every angle. The morning sun was climbing higher and the day was getting hot. Usually, at this time in late August, I would be checking the sugar levels in the grapes, determining the optimal harvest date. Instead, I was cataloging destruction, 147 vines. Some had been completely uprooted, others were partially damaged but would likely die anyway from the trauma. The bulldozer had carved a path about 20 feet wide and maybe 200 feet long through my property. The path would have connected to a trail easement on the neighboring property, creating a continuous walking loop around the development. Except it was through my commercial vineyard, through my livelihood. Martin called me back around 10. I filed the emergency motion. We should have a hearing by tomorrow. In the meantime, I've sent a cease and desist letter to the HOA and personally to Patricia Henderson. If they continue any work, they'll be in serious legal trouble. What are my options here, Martin? Well, first we need to look at the HOA agreement you signed when you bought the property. Do you have a copy? Somewhere in my files. But Martin, I bought this place before the HOA existed. I was one of the original landowners when this area was still mostly vineyard and farmland. The developer sold off parcels, I bought mine, and I've been growing grapes here for 2 decades. And when did the HOA form? Around 2016, I think. A bunch of new houses got built and the owners wanted to establish community standards. I voted against it, but I got outvoted. Did you sign the HOA covenant at that time? I tried to remember. There was some kind of mandatory membership thing. Everyone in the development had to join. I remember being annoyed about it, but the initial rules seemed reasonable. Keep your property maintained, don't paint your house weird colors, that kind of thing. There was nothing about them being able to seize property for projects. Let me pull the documents. If your commercial operation predates the HOA formation, we might have a strong argument that the covenant can't supersede your existing business use. This could actually be a regulatory taking issue. In English, Martin, the government, or in this case, a quasi-governmental organization, like an HOA, can't just take your property for public use without just compensation. Even if they claim it's for community good, they have to properly compensate you for the value. And from what you're describing, $12,000 doesn't even come close. Try $500,000 over the life of these vines. That's what we'll argue. Look, Keith, this could get complicated and expensive. HOA cases can drag on, especially if they have insurance backing them. Are you prepared for a long fight? I looked out at my ruined vines, at the torn earth and wasted potential. I've spent 20 years building this. Yeah, I'm prepared to fight. The emergency hearing was scheduled for the next afternoon in Napa County Superior Court. I spent the intervening time gathering documentation, my business license, tax returns showing income from grape sales, contracts with local wineries, assessments of vine age and production capacity. I also printed out every email and document I could find related to the HOA. What I discovered made me even angrier. There had been a meeting notice sent to an old email address I rarely checked anymore. The notice had mentioned a community enhancement project, but gave no details about what it entailed or where it would be located. The actual vote had apparently happened with only 18 of the 35 HOA members present. 15 voted yes, 3 voted no. The rest, including me, hadn't known anything about it. I also found the original HOA covenant documents. Martin was right. There was language about the association having access to properties for maintenance and community projects, but there was also a clause that explicitly protected pre-existing commercial operations. My vineyard qualified. At the courthouse the next day, I met Martin in the hallway outside the courtroom. He was in his 60s, gray-haired with the tired eyes of someone who had seen too many ridiculous disputes over the years, but he seemed energized by this case. I think we have a good shot at the restraining order, he said. The destruction of commercial agricultural property without proper notice and compensation is pretty egregious. Plus, the HOA's own documents seem to contradict their claim that they had authority to do this. Patricia arrived with her own attorney, a younger woman in an expensive suit who introduced herself as Denise Crawford. She represented the HOA's insurance company. My client is willing to discuss a settlement, Denise said immediately. We recognize there may have been some procedural issues with notice. We're prepared to offer $30,000 to compensate for the damaged vines and to establish the walking trail. Not even close, Martin said. We're looking at potentially $500,000 in lost revenue over the productive life of those vines. Denise actually rolled her eyes. That's an absurd figure based on speculation and best-case scenarios. No court would award anything near that. Then we'll let the court decide. Judge Barbara Simmons was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who clearly didn't want to be dealing with an HOA dispute. She listened to both sides present their arguments, reviewed the documents, and asked several pointed questions about notice, authorization, and the nature of my vineyard operation. Finally, she said, I'm issuing a temporary restraining order, preventing any further work on the walking trail project, pending a full hearing on the merits. The HOA and all its agents are prohibited from entering Mr. Baxter's property or conducting any construction activities. We'll schedule a preliminary injunction hearing for 2 weeks from now. Patricia looked stunned. Denise just nodded, making notes. As we filed out of the courtroom, Patricia cornered me in the hallway. You're making a huge mistake, Keith. The community wants this trail. You're going to become a pariah in this neighborhood. The community can want whatever it likes. They can't take my property to get it. We're not taking anything. We're establishing a right-of-way that benefits everyone, including you. How does destroying my income benefit me? She didn't have an answer for that. She just turned and walked away with her lawyer. Over the next 2 weeks, life in the neighborhood became uncomfortable. Several of my neighbors stopped talking to me. Someone left a nasty note on my door calling me selfish and greedy. At the community pool, a woman I barely knew lectured me about how the walking trail would improve property values and how I was holding everyone back. But a few neighbors supported me. Tom Richardson, who lived 3 houses down, came by with a bottle of wine. I heard about what happened. That's completely messed up. Patricia's gotten too big for her britches with this HOA thing. Did you vote on the trail? Didn't even know about the vote until after it happened. I don't go to the meetings much. Work keeps me busy. But even if I had voted for it, I never would have approved it if I knew it meant destroying your vineyard. Hell, I buy wine made from your grapes at the local shops. Everyone does. That comment gave me an idea. I started reaching out to the wineries that bought my grapes. 3 different operations purchased from me regularly. I explained what had happened and asked if they would be willing to provide statements about the value of my grapes and the impact of losing this production. All 3 agreed immediately. One of them, Vintage Ridge Winery, even offered to help fund my legal battle. Your Cabernet is some of the best fruit we get, the owner told me. Losing that would seriously impact our reserve wine. We have a vested interest in protecting your vineyard. Armed with these statements, Martin and I went into the preliminary injunction hearing with a much stronger case. We could show not just my lost income, but the broader economic impact on the local wine industry. We also had documentation showing that the HOA had failed to follow its own procedures for major projects, which required a 2/3 majority vote, not a simple majority. The 18-person vote, even if all 15 yes votes were valid, didn't meet the threshold from a total membership of 35. Judge Simmons listened to the expanded arguments, reviewed the new evidence, and issued her ruling. I'm granting the preliminary injunction. The evidence suggests that the HOA not only failed to provide adequate notice and compensation, but also failed to follow its own governing procedures. Furthermore, the destruction of an established commercial agricultural operation raises serious questions about property rights and regulatory takings. This matter will proceed to full trial. Patricia's face went white. Denise looked frustrated but unsurprised. As we left the courthouse, Martin said, "This is good, but Keith, you need to understand what comes next. A full trial could take months, maybe over a year. The HOA has insurance, which means they have deep pockets. They might fight this hard rather than settle. Let them fight. I'm not backing down. There's another option. We could sue not just for the damages to the existing vines, but for future lost income. Really go after them for the full value you're claiming. Make it so expensive that they have no choice but to settle or abandon the trail project entirely. Do it." Martin filed an amended complaint seeking $1.2 million in damages. That included the value of the destroyed vines, 20 years of projected lost income, damage to my business relationships, emotional distress, and punitive damages for willful destruction of property. The number was high enough to make headlines in the local newspaper. The article ran with the headline, "Vineyard Owner Sues HOA for over $1 million." It included quotes from me, from Patricia, and from several neighbors. The community reaction was mixed. Some people thought I was being greedy. Others thought the HOA had overstepped badly. What I didn't expect was the phone call I got a week later from a man named Dennis Kowalski. "Mr. Baxter, you don't know me, but I'm a property owner in the Meadowbrook Community HOA in Sacramento. I just read about your case, and I want to tell you that you're fighting the good fight. Our HOA tried something similar 2 years ago, tried to put a community garden on a corner of my lot without permission. I fought them and won. If you need any advice or want to talk strategy, I'm happy to help." Over the next few months, I heard from dozens of people across California who had battled their HOAs over property rights issues. Some had won, some had lost, and some were still fighting. But they all shared the same frustration with organizations that were supposed to serve the community, but instead seemed to serve the egos and agendas of whoever was in charge. The discovery phase of the lawsuit was illuminating. Martin subpoenaed all of the HOA's records related to the walking trail project. What we found was damning. The project had been Patricia's idea from the start. She had been pushing it for over a year before the vote. The landscape architect survey, she mentioned, had been conducted by her brother-in-law, who had no professional credentials. The cost analysis that was presented to the voting members had significantly underestimated expenses by ignoring the need to compensate property owners for land use. Most importantly, we found an email exchange between Patricia and several other board members where they discussed the fact that I would probably object to the trail going through my vineyard. One board member, a woman named Sharon Mitchell, had suggested routing the trail around my property instead. Patricia had replied, "That would add a quarter-mile to the route and defeat the purpose of the direct connection. Keith Baxter doesn't participate in community activities anyway. If he objects, we'll deal with it then. By the time he realizes what's happening, the work will be done." In other words, they had deliberately moved forward, knowing I would object, hoping to present me with a fait accompli that I couldn't reverse. Martin was delighted. This is evidence of intentional wrongdoing. It strengthens our punitive damages claim significantly. The HOA's defense strategy became clear as we approached trial. They were going to argue that the community good outweighed individual property rights, that I had been properly notified according to their procedures, that my damages were overstated, and that my vineyard was more of a hobby than a real business. The hobby argument made me furious. I had my business license, my tax returns showing consistent income, my contracts with wineries, everything documenting that this was a legitimate commercial operation. But Denise Crawford was going to argue that, because I also had a day job as a civil engineer, the vineyard was just a side project and didn't deserve the same protection as a full-time farming operation. It was insulting on multiple levels. The trial was scheduled to begin in March, about 7 months after the initial destruction of my vines. In the meantime, I had to deal with the practical reality of the damage. The destroyed vines couldn't be replaced quickly. Grapevines take 3 to 4 years to begin producing usable fruit, and it takes longer than that to reach full production. Even if I won the lawsuit and got compensation, I was looking at years of lost income. I also had to deal with the physical scar on my property. The bulldozed path was an ugly reminder every time I looked out my window. I considered replanting immediately, but Martin advised me to wait until after the trial. The damaged area served as evidence, and restoring it might undermine our case. As the trial date approached, the HOA made a settlement offer. Denise called Martin and proposed $200,000 to end the case. "It's not enough," I told Martin immediately. "Keith, it's not a bad offer. It's more than the destroyed vines are worth in immediate terms, and it avoids the uncertainty of trial. But it doesn't account for the lost future income, and it doesn't send a message to Patricia and the HOA board that they can't just do whatever they want. You're treating this as a matter of principle now." Damn right I am. They deliberately destroyed my property. They knew I would object, and they did it anyway, hoping I wouldn't be able to stop them. If I settle for $200,000, it just tells them and every other HOA that they can get away with this behavior as long as they pay a fee afterward. Martin sighed. "Okay, we go to trial. But understand that trials are unpredictable. We could win big, or we could end up with less than they're offering now." "I understand." The trial began on a rainy Monday morning in March. The courtroom was surprisingly full. Several of my neighbors attended, both supporters and detractors. The local newspaper had sent a reporter, and there were a handful of people I didn't recognize who later turned out to be from other HOA conflicts, watching to see how this case would turn out. Jury selection took most of the first day. We ended up with 12 jurors and 2 alternates, a mix of ages and backgrounds. Several owned homes in HOA communities. 1 was a farmer. 2 were retirees. Martin seemed satisfied with the composition. Opening statements were on Tuesday. Martin laid out our case clearly and passionately. He showed pictures of the destroyed vineyard, explained the economic value of the vines, walked through the timeline of the HOA's actions, and emphasized the emails showing they knew I would object. D'un retour. "This is not a case about whether walking trails are good or bad," Martin told the jury. "This is a case about property rights, about whether an organization can deliberately destroy someone's livelihood without proper authorization, without adequate compensation, and without even having the courage to have a conversation about it first. The defendants didn't want a conversation because they knew Keith Baxter would say no. So they decided to act first and deal with the consequences later. Well, these are the consequences. Denise Crawford's opening was more defensive. She acknowledged that mistakes had been made in how the project was communicated, but she argued that the HOA had acted within its legal authority under the covenant. She stressed the community benefits of the trail and suggested that my damages were wildly overstated. Mr. Baxter is claiming he lost over $1 million from 147 grapevines, she said. That works out to over $8,000 per vine over 20 years. Does that seem reasonable? These were not rare art pieces, they were grapevines, which can be replaced. Yes, Mr. Baxter suffered some loss. We've acknowledged that and offered compensation. But this lawsuit is not about making him whole. It's about punishing the HOA and extracting an unfair windfall. The first witnesses were technical experts, establishing the value of the vines and the income they generated. I testified about my 20 years of grape growing, my contracts with wineries, my annual yields and prices. The winery owners testified about the quality of my fruit and the impact of losing it. One moment stood out. Marcus Webb from Vintage Ridge Winery brought a bottle of wine made from my grapes to the trial. "This is our 2022 Reserve Cabernet," he said, holding it up. 70% of the fruit in this bottle came from Keith Baxter's vineyard. We charge $150 per bottle, and we sell out every year. The flavor profile from his property is unique because of the soil composition and the age of the vines. You can't just replace that. The HOA's witnesses tried to downplay the value. They brought in their own expert who argued that my yields were overstated, that grape prices fluctuate, that the vines might have suffered from disease or weather damage over time. But Martin shredded these arguments on cross-examination by pointing out that my tax returns and winery contracts showed consistent production and income over many years. Then came the testimony about the HOA's actions. Patricia took the stand, and Martin methodically walked her through the emails, the timeline, the vote, and the decision to proceed without properly notifying me. "Ms. Henderson, you wrote in an email that if Mr. Baxter objected, you would deal with it after the work was done. Is that correct?" Patricia shifted in her seat. "I believed we had the authority to move forward with the project." "That's not what I asked. I asked if you wrote that you would deal with his objections after the work was done." "Yes, I wrote that." "So you anticipated he would object?" "I thought he might be concerned." "Yes." "Concerned that his livelihood was being destroyed?" "I didn't see it that way. I saw it as a small portion of his property being used for community benefit." "Did you or anyone from the HOA ever call Mr. Baxter to discuss the project before sending the bulldozer onto his property?" Patricia hesitated. "No." "Did you ever offer to route the trail around his vineyard?" "That would have made the trail less effective." "That's not what I asked. Did you offer to route it around his property?" "No." "So you decided that your desire for an effective trail route was more important than his commercial vineyard?" "I believed the community interest outweighed individual concerns." "Even though the community interest could have been served by a slightly longer trail route that didn't destroy someone's business," Denise objected, but the point was made. The emails were particularly damaging when read aloud in court. The jury heard Patricia dismissing concerns, minimizing the impact, and deliberately moving forward despite knowing there would be objections. One juror, a middle-aged woman in the front row, shook her head visibly when Martin read the "deal with it later" email. The defense tried to rehabilitate Patricia on redirect, emphasizing her volunteer service to the community and her genuine belief that she was acting within the HOA's authority. But the damage was done. Sharon Mitchell, the board member who had suggested routing the trail differently, testified for the defense but ended up helping our case. Under cross-examination, she admitted that she had thought destroying the vineyard was a bad idea and had tried to stop it. "But Patricia insisted," Sharon said. "She said we had the legal right to do it and the trail would be more valuable with the direct route." "Did you vote in favor of the project?" Martin asked. "Yes, but I thought we would work out the details with Keith first." "Did you ever reach out to Keith yourself to discuss it?" Sharon looked embarrassed. "No, I assumed Patricia was handling it." The trial lasted 2 weeks. In that time, we heard from engineers, grape growers, wine experts, HOA members, and legal specialists in property rights. The courthouse became a temporary hub for discussions about HOA power and limits. In closing arguments, Martin hammered home the core point. The defendants made a choice. They chose convenience over communication. They chose their vision over someone else's property rights. They chose to act and apologize later rather than discuss and collaborate first. And when their actions resulted in massive damage, they offered a fraction of what that damage was worth. Keith Baxter is asking for justice. He's asking to be made whole. He's asking for recognition that you can't just bulldoze through someone's livelihood because it's inconvenient to go around. Denise's closing focused on proportionality. Yes, mistakes were made, but the punishment Mr. Baxter is seeking is vastly disproportionate to the harm. $200,000 is fair compensation for the actual value destroyed. Anything more is windfall, not justice. The jury deliberated for 2 days. I barely slept during that time. Every possible outcome ran through my head. What if they sided with the HOA? What if they awarded me only a token amount? What if they decided I was just being vindictive? On Thursday afternoon, we got the call that the jury had reached a verdict. I met Martin at the courthouse, my stomach in knots. We filed into the courtroom. Patricia and the HOA board members sat on the other side. The jury filed in, their faces unreadable. Judge Simmons asked the jury foreman, a retired teacher, to read the verdict. In the matter of Keith Baxter versus Sonoma Valley Estates Homeowners Association, we, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff. We award damages as follows: $85,000 for the value of destroyed vines, $420,000 for lost income over 20 years, $50,000 for harm to business relationships, and $150,000 in punitive damages. Total award, $705,000. I felt my knees go weak. Martin grabbed my arm to steady me. $705,000. Not the full amount we'd asked for, but close enough to be a complete vindication. Patricia looked like she might faint. The other board members were whispering frantically among themselves. Judge Simmons thanked the jury and dismissed them. Then she addressed the attorneys. I'll enter judgment in accordance with the verdict. The HOA is ordered to pay the award within 60 days. Additionally, I'm permanently enjoining the HOA from any further attempts to establish a walking trail through Mr. Baxter's property or any portion thereof. Outside the courthouse, Martin and I were swarmed by reporters. I kept my comments brief. I'm grateful for the jury's verdict. This was never about being anti-community or anti-trail. It was about protecting property rights and ensuring that people can't just take what doesn't belong to them. A reporter asked, "What will you do with the money?" "Replace my vines, repair my vineyard, and rebuild what was destroyed. That's all I ever wanted." Another reporter turned to Patricia, who was leaving with Denise. "Ms. Henderson, do you have any comment?" Patricia looked at the cameras, her face tight with anger. "The HOA will be exploring all appeal options. This verdict is unjust and hurts every homeowner in our community who will have to pay for it through increased dues." "So you're not apologizing to Mr. Baxter?" Patricia didn't answer. She just got into her car and drove away. The local newspaper ran the story on the front page the next day. Jury awards $705,000 in HOA vineyard destruction case. The article sparked a broader conversation about HOA power and accountability across California. State legislators even started talking about introducing new regulations to prevent similar incidents. For me, the immediate aftermath of the verdict was surreal. I received congratulatory calls from dozens of people, including several other HOA members who admitted they had never liked Patricia's aggressive leadership style. Tom Richardson brought over champagne. The winery owners took me out to dinner. But I also received hate mail from some neighbors who blamed me for the increased HOA dues that would be needed to cover the judgment. One anonymous letter called me a greedy parasite sucking the community dry. Someone else left a dead grapevine on my doorstep with a note saying, "I hope you're happy." The attacks bothered me more than I wanted to admit. I had lived in this community for 20 years. I had friendships here, memories, a sense of belonging. Now, I was the villain in some people's eyes, the man who had cost everyone money. But Martin reminded me of something important. The HOA's insurance will cover most of this. The actual impact on dues won't be as bad as Patricia is making it sound. She's trying to turn people against you to save face. He was right. When the HOA treasurer released the actual numbers a few weeks later, the insurance coverage meant that dues would only increase by about $50 per household per year for 2 years to cover the deductible. Hardly the catastrophic burden Patricia had suggested. The HOA did file an appeal, arguing that the damages were excessive and that the jury had been improperly influenced by prejudice against homeowner associations. The appeal process took another 8 months. During that time, I couldn't touch the money, couldn't replant, couldn't truly move forward. It was frustrating, but I also understood that this was part of the price of fighting. You don't take on an organization with lawyers and insurance backing without expecting a long battle. The appellate court heard arguments in November. Martin presented our case again, emphasizing that the jury had heard all the evidence and made a reasonable determination based on that evidence. The HOA's attorney argued that the 20-year income projection was speculative and should be reduced significantly. The 3-judge panel issued their ruling in January, almost 18 months after the original destruction of my vines. They upheld the verdict in full, finding that the jury's award was supported by the evidence and that the trial court had properly instructed the jury on damages. It was over. Finally, truly over. The HOA had no more appeals available. They had to pay. The check arrived in February, delivered by certified mail. $705,000 plus accrued interest, minus the contingency fee for Martin and court costs. The net amount was just over $550,000. It was the most money I had ever seen in my life. But more than the money, it was the vindication. The legal system had recognized that what the HOA did was wrong. A jury of regular people had looked at the facts and decided that my property rights mattered more than Patricia Henderson's vision of a perfect walking trail. I started the replanting process immediately. New vines were expensive, especially at the quality level I wanted. I consulted with agricultural specialists to ensure proper soil preparation in the damaged area. The bulldozer had compacted the earth badly, and it took work to restore proper drainage and nutrient levels. Planting day was emotional. Tom Richardson came over to help. So did Marcus Webb from the winery and several other neighbors who had supported me throughout the ordeal. We spent a full weekend putting in new vines, 147 of them, positioned exactly where the old ones had been. These won't produce for a few years, I told everyone as we worked, but when they do, I'll make sure to share the wine with all of you. As we finished planting the last vine, Tom raised a beer bottle. To property rights and stubborn bastards who fight for them. Everyone laughed and drank to that. Life slowly returned to normal over the following months. The controversy faded from the news. People stopped arguing about it at community gatherings. Patricia Henderson served out the remainder of her term as HOA president, but didn't run for re-election. The new president was a much more reasonable guy named Andrew Foster, who made it his mission to repair relationships and ensure proper procedures were followed for all community projects. Andrew actually came to visit me personally a few months after taking office. Keith, I want to apologize on behalf of the HOA for what happened. It was wrong, and it should never have gotten to the point it did. I hope we can move forward. I appreciated the gesture. I don't have anything against the HOA as a concept, Andrew. I just couldn't let them destroy my vineyard. If Patricia had come to me first, we probably could have worked something out. Could we have routed the trail around your property? Easily. Or you could have gone through a different section where I have regular grass instead of vines. There were options. But Patricia didn't want to hear options. She wanted what she wanted. Andrew nodded. I've heard that from a lot of people. I think her heart was in the right place, but her methods were terrible. Where's Patricia now? She and her husband sold their house and moved to Arizona. I think the whole ordeal got to be too much for her. I felt a twinge of something. Not quite sympathy, but not satisfaction either. Patricia had cost herself far more than she'd cost me in the end. She'd lost her position, her reputation, and ultimately her home in the community she'd tried to improve. It was a cautionary tale about the dangers of good intentions without good judgment. The new vines grew well. I tended them carefully, pruning and training them exactly as I had the original plants. The vineyard slowly healed, the scar fading as new growth filled in the gaps. 3 years after the trial, those new vines produced their first small crop. The grapes weren't ready for premium wine yet, but they were a start. Marcus Webb came by during harvest and tasted them. Pfft, these are going to be good, Keith. Really good. Give them another couple of years and we'll be making reserve wine from them again. 5 years after the trial, the vineyard was back to full production. The new vines had matured beautifully, and the entire property looked much as it had before the bulldozer came through. If you didn't know where to look, you couldn't tell there had ever been damage. I was in my 60s by then, starting to think about retirement and what I would do with the property long term. My daughter Emma had expressed interest in taking over the vineyard someday. She'd moved back to California and was working in the wine industry, learning the business from the ground up. One evening, Emma and I were walking through the vineyard at sunset, checking on the vines, when she asked, "Dad, was it worth it? All the fighting and stress and years of legal battles?" I thought about the question carefully. You know, when it was happening, I was so angry I couldn't see straight. It consumed everything. But looking back, yeah, it was worth it. Not because of the money, though that helped. It was worth it because I stood up for something that mattered. I didn't let someone take what was mine just because it was easier to give in. Do you ever regret how public it got? All the news coverage and people taking sides? Sometimes. I lost friends over it. The neighborhood was divided for a long time, but I also connected with people all over the state who were fighting similar battles. I heard from farmers and small business owners and regular homeowners who felt powerless against their HOAs. Some of them used my case as a model for their own fights. A few even won because of the precedent we set. Emma smiled. "So you're a hero to the anti-HOA crowd." "I wouldn't go that far. I'm just a guy who didn't want his grapevines bulldozed." We stood there in the fading light, surrounded by rows of healthy vines heavy with fruit. In a few weeks we would harvest them. The grapes would go to local wineries, where they would be crushed and fermented and aged into wine. People would drink that wine at dinners and celebrations, never knowing the battle that had been fought to keep these vines alive. That was fine with me. The fight had never been about glory or recognition. It had been about principle, about the fundamental right to be left alone on your own property as long as you weren't hurting anyone else. The sun dipped below the hills, and the vineyard was bathed in purple twilight. Emma put her arm around my shoulders. "Come on, Dad, let's go inside. I'll open a bottle of the 2024 Reserve." "The one made from these vines?" "The very same." We walked back to the house together, leaving the vineyard to rest in the gathering darkness. Behind us, the new vines rustled in the evening breeze, indistinguishable now from their neighbors, part of the continuous fabric of the vineyard that had almost been destroyed, but had survived. The walking trail was never built. The HOA eventually developed a different route through undeveloped common areas, and it was completed without controversy about 2 years after the trial ended. People used it regularly, and it did become a nice amenity for the community. I even used it myself sometimes, walking the loop in the early mornings when the air was cool and the valley was quiet. I would pass neighbors and wave, and most would wave back. The animosity had faded with time, replaced by a kind of grudging acceptance on all sides. One morning, I encountered Sharon Mitchell on the trail. We hadn't spoken since the trial. She looked embarrassed when she saw me, like she might turn around and go the other way. "Good morning, Sharon," I said. "Oh, Keith, good morning." We stood there awkwardly for a moment. Then she said, "I'm sorry. I should have said that a long time ago. I'm sorry for what happened. I should have fought harder against the plan." "You tried," I said. "You suggested routing it differently." "I should have done more than suggest. I should have voted no. I should have called you myself. I took the easy way out and you paid the price." I appreciated her honesty. "It's in the past, Sharon. We all move forward." She nodded, tears in her eyes. "Thank you for saying that. I've felt guilty about it for years." We talked for a few more minutes, just small talk about the neighborhood and our families. Then we went our separate ways on the trail. It was a small moment of reconciliation, but it meant something. As I completed the loop and headed back home, I thought about everything that had happened since that morning when the bulldozer showed up. The shock, the anger, the legal battles, the victory, the slow healing. It had been a long journey, but I had come through it intact. My vineyard was whole again. My business was thriving. And I had learned something valuable about standing up for yourself, even when it's hard, even when people criticize you, even when the fight seems impossible. Sometimes you have to draw a line and say no, not out of stubbornness or spite, but out of simple respect for what's yours and what you've built. That's what I had done. And in the end, I had won not just a legal judgment, but something more important, the knowledge that I hadn't backed down. The sun was fully up now, warming the valley, promising another beautiful day in wine country. I walked into my house, poured a cup of coffee, and looked out the window at my vineyard. The vines were green and healthy, full of promise. 20 years of destroyed harvests, the lawsuit had claimed. 20 years of income lost. But I had recovered it all through the court system, and now I was building 20 more years of harvests. 40 years total from these vines, if I was lucky, maybe 50. That was the real victory. Not the money or the vindication, but the continuity. The ability to keep doing what I loved on the land I owned without interference from people who thought they knew better. I raised my coffee cup to the vineyard, a silent toast to the vines that had survived and the new ones that had taken root. Then I sat down to plan the day's work, just another ordinary day in the extraordinary life of a California grape grower who had stood up to an HOA and lived to tell the tale. Years later, when Emma took over the vineyard full-time, she hung a small plaque in the tasting room we built for visitors. It read, "These vines have been growing since 2004. They survived disease, drought, and even a bulldozer. Like the family that tends them, they're resilient." Visitors would ask about the bulldozer part, and Emma would tell them the story. Some would be shocked, others would laugh, and a few would share their own HOA horror stories. It became part of the vineyard's identity, the place that fought back and won. The wine from those replanted vines, the ones that grew where the destruction had been, became some of our best. Maybe it was the extra attention I gave them, or maybe it was something about the soil being disturbed and renewed, but whatever the reason, those grapes produced exceptional wine. Marcus Webb once told me, "You know, Keith, some of the best wines come from vines that have suffered. Stress can produce deeper flavors, more complex characteristics. Maybe your vineyard is like that now. It suffered, but it came back stronger." I liked that interpretation. It made the whole ordeal seem less like a disaster and more like a transformation. Not that I would have chosen it, not that I recommend getting your vineyard bulldozed as a cultivation technique, but if you're going to suffer damage, at least make something good come from it. The legal precedent from my case did help others. I heard from at least a dozen property owners over the following years who used the verdict as leverage in their own HOA disputes. Some settled quickly once their HOAs realized they might face similar judgments. Others went to trial and won. A few lost, but even they told me they were glad they'd fought. The California legislature eventually passed new regulations requiring HOAs to get explicit written consent before conducting any work on private property that wasn't clearly covered by maintenance agreements. They called it the Homeowner Property Protection Act. And while my case wasn't the only factor in its passage, it was cited frequently during the debates. I attended the signing ceremony when the governor approved it. Several other plaintiffs from HOA cases were there too. We stood together as the governor spoke about property rights and the need for balance between community governance and individual freedom. Homeowner associations serve an important purpose, the governor said, but they must be held accountable when they overstep. No organization should have the power to destroy someone's livelihood without due process and fair compensation. This law ensures that won't happen again. It felt good to be part of something larger than my own case, to know that the fight I'd undertaken had resulted in real change that would protect others. But at the end of the day, I was just a grape grower who loved his vines and wasn't willing to let anyone take them away without a fight. That's all I ever was, and that's all I needed to be. The vineyard is still producing today, decades after that bulldozer tried to end it. Emma runs it now with her partner, and they've expanded into new varieties and techniques I never imagined. But the core of it, those old vines in the replanted section where the trail almost went, those are still there, still producing, still standing as proof that you can fight City Hall, or in this case, fight your HOA, and sometimes, if you're determined and right, you can win. That's the story of how my HOA tore up my vineyard for a walking trail and how I sued them for 20 years of destroyed harvests and won. It wasn't easy, it wasn't quick, and it wasn't pleasant, but it was necessary, and it was worth it. Every time I taste wine made from those vines, I remember the battle and the victory. And I smile, knowing that justice, while sometimes slow, can still prevail when someone is willing to stand up and demand it.